Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. The memory still haunts me to this day, a chilling reminder of how quickly innocence can be shattered in the face of true evil. It was a warm summer afternoon, and I was just a kid, no more than 7 or 8 years old, playing in the park near my house without a care in the world. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was filled with the laughter of children and the distant hum of lawnmowers. I was lost in my own little world, constructing elaborate castles in the sandbox, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see a man standing there, a friendly smile on his face. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and crinkles around his eyes that made him look kind and trustworthy. "Hey there, little one," he said, kneeling down to my level. "I couldn't help but notice you playing all alone. Do you like puppies?" My eyes widened at the mention of puppies, and I nodded eagerly. What kid doesn't love puppies? I could already picture them in my mind. Tiny, fluffy balls of energy, yipping and tumbling over each other. The man's smile grew wider, and he leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, I have a secret to tell you. I had a whole litter of the cutest puppies you've ever seen right here in my car. They're just waiting for a nice kid like you to come and play with them." In that moment, all warnings and stranger danger lessons my parents had drilled into my head evaporated like mist. The promise of puppies was too tempting to resist. I glanced around the park, suddenly realizing how far I had wandered from the watchful eyes of my parents. But the man seemed so nice, so trustworthy. Surely there was no harm in just taking a quick peek at the puppies, right? Hand in hand, we walked to his car, parked just on the outskirts of the park. It was a nondescript set-in, the kind you'd see a dozen times a day without a second glance. The man fumbled with his keys for a moment before unlocking the rear door. "Go ahead. Take a look inside," he said, gesturing towards the dark interior of the car. "The puppies are waiting for you." I hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of fear passing through me. But the man's encouraging smile and the thought of those cute puppies quickly pushed any doubts aside. I leaned forward, peering into the back seat, expecting to see a wriggling mass of fur and wagging tails. But there were no puppies, only a cold, empty expanse of worn upholstery and the sickly sweet smell of stale cigarettes. Before I could even process what was happening, the man's demeanor shifted. Gone was the friendly facade, replaced by something cold and sinister. In one swift motion, he shoved me into the back seat, my head smacking against the far door as I tumbled in. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the interior of the car into darkness. I remember the roughness of the upholstery against my skin as I struggled to right myself, my heart pounding in my ears. Panic seized my chest as the gravity of my situation sank in. I was trapped, alone with the predator who had lured me in with the promise of something innocent and joyful. The car lurched into motion, the sudden movement throwing me back against the seat. I could hear the man breathing heavily in the front, a sound that filled me with a sickening dread. Tears streamed down my face as I pounded on the windows, screaming for help until my throat was raw. But the windows were tinted, and the busy street outside seemed oblivious to my desperate pleas. As we drove, the scenery outside began to change, morphing from the familiar tree-lined streets of my neighborhood to grim industrial stretches of warehouses and abandoned lots. My mind raced with all the horrific possibilities of what this man had in store for me. Would he hurt me? Kill me? Sell me to some far-off place where I'd never see my family again? I silently prayed to every deity I could think of, bargaining with the universe for a miracle. I promised to be good, to listen to my parents, to never talk to strangers again. Anything to escape the nightmare I had found myself in. Minutes stretched into hours, and the dull ache of hunger and thirst began to gnaw at my stomach. The man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if I were nothing more than a piece of cargo he was transporting to some unknown destination. Just as I was about to give in to despair, a glimmer of hope appeared in the rearview mirror. A flash of red and blue lights, the unmistakable whoop of a police siren, cutting through the dull roar of the engine. We were being pulled over. The man cursed under his breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the steering wheel. He glared at me through the mirror, a silent warning to keep my mouth shut. But I knew this was my one chance at salvation. As the police officer approached the driver's side window, I mustered every ounce of courage in my small body. Lunging forward, I pressed my face against the glass, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Help me. Please help me. He took me and I want to go home." The man tried to silence me, his hand reaching back to grab at me, but it was too late. The officer's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, a grown man with a terrified, crying child in the back seat of his car. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man hesitated for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, calculating his options. But with the officer's hand resting on his holster and the weight of the law on his side, he had no choice but to comply. As the man was cuffed and led away to the waiting police cruiser, another officer opened the rear door of the car, reaching in to lift me out. I remember clinging to him, my small body shaking with sobs of relief and residual fear. In the chaos that followed, I learned that the man's car had been flagged for expired insurance, a minor infraction that had ultimately led to his downfall. The officer had simply been doing his job, pulling over a vehicle with a questionable record. He had no idea that his routine traffic stop would end up saving a life that day. It was just another ordinary day at the park with my daughter, or so I thought. The sun was shining, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. I watched as my little girl ran around the playground, her pigtails bouncing with each step. She was so full of joy and innocence, completely unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. I was sitting on a bench, scrolling through my phone when I first noticed the van. It was a nondescript vehicle, the kind you see 1,000 times a day without giving it a second thought. But something about it set off alarm bells in my head. Maybe it was the way it cruised slowly past the playground, or the fact that the windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside. I tried telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I saw the van circling back around, and my heart started to pound. I stood up, my eyes scanning the playground for my daughter. She was nowhere to be seen. Panic rising in my throat, I called out her name, my voice getting louder and more frantic with each passing second. And then I heard it, a muffled scream coming from the direction of the van. I spun around just in time to see a man shoving my little girl into the back of the vehicle, his hand clamped over her mouth. Time seemed to slow down as I sprinted towards the van, my feet pounding against the pavement. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the world around me. But it was too late. The van peeled out of the parking lot, its tires screeching as it sped away. For a moment, I stood there in shock, my mind reeling with the horror of what had just happened. But then a surge of adrenaline kicked in, and I ran towards my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door. I didn't even bother with my seatbelt as I jammed the key into the ignition and stomped on the gas. The van was already a couple of blocks ahead of me, weaving through traffic like a snake. I gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white, my eyes locked on the vehicle that held my precious daughter. I could feel hot tears streaming down my face, blurring my vision, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the road. As I followed the van onto the highway, I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed for help from authorities. The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but I could barely choke out the words to explain what was happening. I gave them the make and model of the van along with my location, begging them to send help. The chase felt like it lasted an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a matter of minutes. The van swerved in and out of lanes, its movements erratic and reckless. At one point, it nearly clipped another car, sending it spinning off the road. I felt a surge of anger coursing through my veins, mixed with a sickening sense of fear for my daughter's safety. As we approached a stretch of road with no other cars in sight, I saw my chance. I hit the gas, my own car engine roaring as I pulled up alongside the van. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of my daughter's face in the window, her eyes wide with terror. I wanted to reach out and grab her, to pull her to safety, but I knew that I couldn't risk a collision at this speed. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I rammed my car into the side of the van, sending it careening off the road and into a ditch. The impact was jarring, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer by the second. I stumbled out of my car, my head spinning as I made my way towards the wrecked van. The driver's side door was crumpled inward, and I could see the man who had taken my daughter slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. But my attention was focused solely on the back of the van, where I could hear my little girl's cries. I yanked open the door, nearly tearing off its hinges in my desperation. And there she was, my baby, her face streaked with tears and her body shaking with sobs. I scooped her up in my arms, holding her close as I whispered soothing words into her ear. The relief that washed over me was indescribable, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I could feel her little arms clinging to me, her face buried in my neck as she cried. The police arrived on the scene moments later, their sirens blaring and lights flashing. They took the kidnapper into custody, his wrists bound behind his back as he was led away to a waiting squad car. I barely registered their presence, too focused on my daughter to care about anything else. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The trauma of that day lingered like a dark cloud over our lives, affecting us in ways that I couldn't even begin to understand. My daughter had nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, and I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every sudden noise and imagining danger around every corner. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the love and support of our family and friends, we began to heal. My daughter started to smile again, her laughter once more filling our home with joy. And I've learned to let go of the fear and guilt that had consumed me, realizing that I had done everything in my power to protect her. Looking back on that terrible day, I knew that I would do it all again in a heartbeat, because when it comes to the safety and well-being of our children, there is nothing that we wouldn't do. We are their protectors, their guardians, and their fiercest advocates. And though the scars of that experience will always be a part of us, I know that we will emerge stronger and more resilient than ever before. Because in the end, love is the most powerful force in the universe. And it is love that will guide us through even the darkest of times, leading us back into the light. I was walking through the park, enjoying the sunny weather and the sound of birds chirping in the trees. It was the kind of day that made you feel grateful to be alive, like anything was possible. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of young kids, no more than 6 or 7 years old, were being led away by a woman in a dark hooded sweatshirt. At first, I thought maybe it was just a teacher or a caretaker taking them on a field trip. But something about the way she moved, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being followed, set off alarm bells in my head. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up to them without drawing too much attention to myself. As I got closer, I could see the fear in the children's eyes. They looked confused and scared, like they didn't know what was happening or where they were going. The woman must have sensed my presence because she suddenly started walking faster, her grip tightening on the kids' hands. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest as I called out to her, asking what she was doing with those children. She didn't even turn around. Instead, she started running, dragging the kids along with her like they were nothing more than baggage. I chased after them, my legs pumping as I dodged around trees and benches, determined not to let them out of my sight. I could hear the kids crying now, their small voices filled with terror and confusion. They were stumbling and tripping as they tried to keep up with the woman's pace, their little hands straining against her iron grip. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with the effort as I closed the distance between us. I couldn't let her get away, couldn't let those kids disappear into the unknown. Finally, I got close enough to reach out and grab the woman's arm. She spun around, her hood falling back to reveal a face I didn't recognize. Her eyes were wild and darting like a cornered animal ready to lash out. I yanked her away from the kids, putting myself between them and her. She tried to push past me, her hands clawing at my face and arms, but I stood my ground, my fists clenched and ready to fight if I had to. That's when the kids started talking, their words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confusion. They said the woman had approached them in the park, promising to take them to her house for candy and games. They hadn't realized anything was wrong until she started leading them away from the playground, her grip on their hands getting tighter and tighter until it hurt. I felt a surge of anger and disgust wash over me, so strong that it made my vision blur and my hands shake. How could someone prey on innocent children like that? What kind of monster would try to lure them away from safety with false promises and lies? I pulled out my phone and dialed the cops, my fingers trembling as I explained the situation to the operator. The woman tried to run again, but a group of bystanders who had seen the commotion stepped in to help me block her path. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens blaring as they pulled up to the scene. They handcuffed the woman and took her away, her face twisted with rage and frustration as she screamed obscenities at everyone around her. I stayed with the kids until their parents arrived, trying to comfort them as best I could. They clung to me, their small bodies trembling with fear and relief as they'd buried their faces in my shirt. As I watched them reunite with their families, tears streaming down their faces as they hugged and kissed them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of overwhelming gratitude. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't trusted my instincts and intervened when I did, who knows what could have happened to those kids. But even as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what had almost occurred sank in, I knew that I couldn't let this incident fade into the background. I had to do something to prevent it from happening again, to make sure that no other child would have to experience the terror and trauma of being taken by a stranger. In the weeks and months that followed, I became an advocate for child safety. I spoke at schools and community events, sharing my story and educating parents and kids alike about the dangers of stranger abduction. I worked with local law enforcement to develop better protocols for responding to missing child cases, and I lobbied for harsher penalties for those who would dare to prey on society's most vulnerable members. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. I had nightmares about that day in the park, about what could have happened if I hadn't been there to stop it. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing and my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But every time I felt like giving up, every time the darkness threatened to overtake me, I thought of those kids. I thought of their innocent faces, their trusting eyes, and the way they had looked at me like I was their savior. And I knew that I couldn't stop, not until every child was safe and protected from the monsters that lurked in the shadows. Looking back on that day in the park, I realized that it was a turning point in my life. It was the moment when I realized that we all had a responsibility to look out for one another, to stand up against evil and injustice wherever we find it. We can't always rely on someone else to be the hero. Sometimes, we have to be the ones to step up and make a difference. Because the truth is, we never know when we might be called upon to be someone's guardian angel. We never know when a split-second decision, a moment of courage, and compassion could mean the difference between life and death for a child in need. It's been years, but the memories of those horrifying days still haunt me like it was yesterday. I was just a kid, carefree and innocent, never imagining that my world could be shattered in an instant. I remember the day it happened like it was burned into my mind, every detail etched in perfect clarity. It was a day just like any other. I was walking home from school, my backpack heavy with homework and my mind wandering to the latest video game I couldn't wait to play. The sun was shining, and I could hear the birds chirping in the trees. It was the kind of day that made you feel alive, like anything was possible. But then, in a split second, everything changed. I didn't notice the car that had been following me for blocks, didn't hear the footsteps creeping up behind me until it was too late. Rough hands grabbed me from behind, clamping over my mouth before I could scream. I kicked and thrashed, but my small body was no match for the strength of my attacker. I was thrown into the back of a van, my head smacking against the floor as the door slammed shut behind me. I remember the smell of the carpet, musty and damp, as I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the engine rumbling to life, feel the vibrations beneath me as we sped away to some unknown destination. When the van finally stopped, I was dragged out and thrown over someone's shoulder like a sack of potatoes. I caught a glimpse of a rundown house, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling before I was carried inside and down a flight of stairs. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy with the stench of mold and decay. I was tossed onto a bare mattress, my hands and feet bound with rough rope that chafed against my skin. I remember the feeling of the concrete floor beneath me, hard and unforgiving, as I struggled to sit up. For 2 days, I lay there in the darkness, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. I couldn't understand why this was happening to me, what I had done to deserve such a fate. Time seemed to stand still in that basement, each minute stretching out into an eternity of terror and despair. My captor would come down periodically, bringing me scraps of food and water, just enough to keep me alive. He never spoke to me, never even looked me in the eye. It was like I was nothing more than an object to him, a thing to be used and discarded at will. I remember the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the way my heart would race each time he approached. I tried to be brave, tried to hold on to the hope that someone would find me, that I would be rescued from this nightmare. But as the hours turned into days, that hope began to fade, replaced by a sinking feeling of despair. I couldn't help but think of all the stories I had heard about kids who had gone missing and were never found. I thought about my family, my friends, everyone I loved and missed so desperately. I wondered if they were looking for me, if they even knew I was gone. The thought of never seeing them again, of spending the rest of my life in this dark, dank hell was almost too much to bear. But then, on the third day, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of sirens, of shouts, and footsteps pounding overhead. My heart leaped in my chest as I realized what was happening. The police had come, they had found me at last. The next few moments were a blur of activity and confusion. I heard the door being kicked in, heard the shouts of the officers as they stormed the basement. I felt hands on me, gentle this time, untying my bonds and lifting me off the mattress. I was carried up the stairs and out into the sunlight, blinking and dazed after so long in the darkness. I saw the flashing lights of the police cars, the concerned faces of the officers as they wrapped me in a blanket and led me to an ambulance. I remember the feeling of the sun on my face, the way the fresh air filled my lungs like a balm. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened to me. I had nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, convinced that I was back in that basement, that my rescue had been nothing more than a cruel dream. I couldn't stand to be alone, couldn't bear the thought of being in the dark. But slowly, with the help of my family and a team of dedicated therapists, I began to heal. I learned to talk about what had happened, to process the trauma and the fear in a healthy way. I learned that it was okay to feel scared, to feel angry, to feel all the things that I had tried so hard to push down. I also learned that my captor had been caught, that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he had done to me and to other children like me. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Knowing that he could never hurt anyone else gave me a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had been served. Looking back on those terrifying days, I realized that they changed me in ways that I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the dangers that lurk in the world. But I'm also stronger, more resilient than I ever thought possible. I've learned that I can survive anything, that I have a strength inside me that cannot be broken.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.